So my name is Michael Cowan. I am the current board chairman for Georgia Native Plant Society and also an active member of the North Metro Chapter Education Committee, and that is who is bringing you this webinar. So today we are very excited to have Dr. Storm back with us. So he is a professor of biology at South Carolina Upstate. But how I got to know him, he runs the Facebook page called Southern Piedmont Natural History. And if you aren't friends with that and you're on Facebook, I really encourage you all to do that. So he has sometimes several posts a day, but usually at least once a day with some interesting stuff about plants and all the different types of animals in the Southern Piedmont, which includes a lot of Georgia and also obviously South Carolina. So I encourage you to do that for sure. So without further delay, I give you Dr. Storm.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael, and welcome everybody. All right. So we're going to talk about various non-native plants and how they got here, particularly to the southeastern United States, but across the eastern U.S., and also look at the invasive ones and how they got here as well within those non-native plants. If you look at somebody's yard nowadays and you look at how many yards are landscaped, what you're oftentimes going to see is a lot of plants that are not native to Georgia. So as an example, from this particular yard here, you might find crepe myrtle, very common in yards, common around buildings, in parking lots, things like that. Glossy privet, boxwoods around the front door, English ivy maybe as a ground cover, Bermuda grass as the grass growing in your yard, some Chinese fringe flower bushes, and maybe some dandelions here and there as well in the yard or the nearby roadside. The point is that all of these things are from somewhere else, many of them from Europe or Asia or some combination of both perhaps, but they're not from here. So how did these things get here and become so common across our landscape, so common in our horticulture? That's what we're going to talk about today. So the three things we're going to go into is the plant trade between Europe and North America, how we've exchanged plants, why that was occurring, and why certain individuals that were doing horticulture early in American history, why didn't they just use North American plants? They're right here. Why do you have to get something from Asia or from Europe? So what was their motivation with doing that? And then we'll also look at some intentional introductions of non-native plants that became problematic, things like kudzu, and why we brought that over here and how that got into the United States. So if we look at non-native plants used in horticulture across the United States, that's the primary reason for how non-native plants got here to North America. 60% of those non-native plants came for the intent purpose of horticulture. About 30% came over for some sort of conservation focus, be it for soil. We'll see that is the case for kudzu later on as one of the motivations, but also
you
for
want some, we've got some of those salon pass patches that you could put on your back.
Some of the wildlife conservation as well, but also some are accidental introductions that we didn't really mean to bring them in, but they came in accidentally as seeds or maybe in with soil. They got here in some other mechanism. So we'll talk about some of those different ways as well. So this whole trading of plants began really after Columbus came to North America. So from 1492 onward, we enter what some people call the Great Columbian Exchange, where plants and animals are exchanged between North America and Europe, South America and Europe, Asia. And so things like cattle and horses get brought from Europe to North America, as you see right here. But also things from the Americas go over to Europe, like maize and potatoes. A lot of this started out with agricultural products, but it sort of sets the stage for later on bringing over other things like plants and horticultural products once the agricultural products had been exchanged. So if we look at a timeline of when some of the common horticultural plants of North America go over to Europe, it started off pretty early. The common sunflower, for instance, sent over to Europe sometime around in the 1500s. Other plants that you might have growing in your yard or you've seen off in the woods, Virginia spiderwort, has been over in Europe since 1629, planted in people's gardens. The red maple, the tulip tree, many different plants that are quite common here in the southeastern US have been over there in Europe for centuries as well. So the reason those plants went over there were primarily for people with a lot of wealth and a lot of power. So people like King Louis XVI, who funded Andre Michaud to come to North America, come to New Jersey, to South Carolina, to send plants of the eastern US back to France for use in their horticulture, for use in the gardens, use in their woodlands. Dr. John Fothergill, who was a funder of William Bartram and his expeditions, and helping him to have the money that he needs to do the work that Bartram did. He received plants from eastern United States. Charles I, he funded the Tradescants and their explorations over to the United States. That's how Virginia spiderwort got back over to Europe, for instance. It was funded through Charles I. So the people that wanted these plants were not really your farmers and cobblers and blacksmiths, that sort of a thing. It was people with lots of money and power and influence. They had the means to be able to get these plants from the other side of the Atlantic and pay people to bring them back to them. That's really the only way to get these plants back at that time period in the 1600s and 1700s. So from their perspective, it kind of goes back to the old saying of the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. From their way of looking at things, the plants are always greener on the other side of the ocean. There's something about those plants over there that are just different. They wanted them because of their beauty or to have some prestige of, I'm the only person that has this plant in all of Europe. It's just me. And to show your power and to show the things that you had that nobody else in Europe had other than you. That was an important thing for some of these kings and lords and dukes over there in Europe. And so they brought these plants over to Europe to put into their gardens. Now, sending those plants over could be pretty challenging early on. Some of them might go over pretty well as a seed, but trying to get them to survive as a plant that would go back to Europe is pretty challenging to cross an ocean and sail for weeks and to get that plant to survive. But they eventually got much more successful with doing that once Nathaniel Ward invented this little glass terrarium right here called the Wardian case. So he invented this in 1829, and it's basically a mobile terrarium that you can load up with your plants, put them in there in the colonies, put that on the ship, and then sail back to Europe. And many of these plants will hopefully survive that passage and not die from salt spray exposure, not die from drying out. This increased the chance of those plants surviving the voyage much better than what they were having for a success rate before. So that Wardian case really increased their success of getting those plants back to Europe. In terms of who was sending them lots of plants, one of the people sending them back to Europe, but also giving plants here in the US, was John Bartram. Bartram established the first botanic garden in the United States. You can see a picture of that right here, his garden near Philadelphia. And he was being funded and sending these plants back to England from this individual right here, Peter Collinson. So that's where his money came from to send a lot of these plants back over to Europe. Eventually, Bartram became the royal botanist to King George III, and that's where a lot of those plants ultimately went, was into the royal family and their gardens, but lots of plants going back to Europe through the influence of John Bartram and also William Bartram, his son, from their garden there in Philadelphia. So we've got some of the correspondence that Bartram had with Collinson and what they were asking for in Europe, the things that they found that were growing well, what was interesting, what was pretty in their gardens over there. And here's one example of that correspondence from Peter Collinson, that's a funder of Bartram, and what they liked for the plant that they were receiving from John Bartram. So, as Collinson said here, send more black walnuts, long walnuts, and both sorts of hickory, acorns of all sorts, sweet gum, dogwood, red cedar berries, allspice, sassafras. These will be acceptable to the Duke of Richmond, and Lord Peter will like some more. Pack all the seed the same way as last year, for they succeed very well, a few accepted. So, telling them what more we want, what's doing pretty well, and how their gardens look with these interesting new plants that they're receiving from the colonies there in North America. So many letters are still kept and known of today between Collinson and Bartram. Here's one talking about the growth of those plants that Collinson received from Bartram. As he says here, this is September 1st, 1741. A friend John, the trees and shrubs raised from first seeds are grown to great maturity. Last year, Lord Peter planted out about 10,000 Americans, which, being at the same time mixed with about 20,000 Europeans and some Asians, make a very beautiful appearance. Great art and skill being shown in consulting everyone's particular growth. When I walk amongst them, one cannot help thinking he is in North American thickets. There are such quantities. So they really liked these plants. Lord Peter was putting them out in his garden at Thorndon Hall, his estate there in Essex, and really liked all of these interesting plants that were coming from North America that were not anything like what they could get in Europe, things that they had never seen before and were prestigious to have in your garden there at Thorndon Hall or wherever they were being sent. So some of those plants that got sent over, things like the sassafras that we enjoy finding in woodlands here, those were popular over in gardens with Lord Peter and others. The tulip poplar was a common plant to send over. Trumpet creeper, Virginia spiderwort, and many, many more became quite common in the gardens of English aristocrats and others throughout Europe. So Collinson, once he would receive these seeds, he would put out advertisements for people to know what had come over from John Bartram and what was available, perhaps for sale. And so Collinson put out in advertisements here, this is in the Gentleman's Magazine and Historical Chronicle in London from 1754. And if you look at the title here, it says a list of seeds of forest trees and flowering shrubs gathered in Pennsylvania, the Jerseys, and New York by John and William Bartram over the last year to their correspondents, like Collinson, being the largest collection that has ever before been imported into this kingdom. So if you look at the list here, it's got some of our common native trees, things like the Judas tree, as it's sometimes called, or more commonly called the redbud. So off that goes to England, and they're growing it in the gardens of Europe now with our redbud tree. The dogwood, flowering dogwood, was popular over there as a new tree that hadn't been seen before. The sweet gum, ironic as it might seem, a lot of people don't like the sweet gum tree here in the Southeast with all of the gum balls, but it was a pretty popular tree over there, part of which probably because of the colors of those leaves. People in England were not used to the fall colors, that you would see on plants coming from North America. That color change of the fall isn't something that they really have. And so that was an interesting thing to see in some of these plants that would have some color change. Persimmon was another one that was sent over and popular. So persimmon fruits sent over there to England by John Bartram to go off to Collinson and the King and many others there in Europe back in the 1700s. But Bartram wasn't the only person sending plants over to England. Now, Bartram was receiving some plants from England as well and distributing those around the colonies, but a lot of what he was doing at this point was sending things off to England. So another person sending plants off to England and to tell them about the wonders of the New World here in the colonies was Mark Catesby. This individual here, Mark Catesby. Now, you may know of Mark Catesby from another one of his books, Natural History, published before this, where he describes his explorations around the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida, the Caribbean. That's the same Mark Catesby, just with another book of his published shortly after he died called Hortus Europa Americanus, and a really long title that's informative because it tells you pretty much what the book is about. So Hortus Europa Americanus, or a collection of 85 curious trees and shrubs, the produce of North America, adapted to the climates and soils of Great Britain, Ireland, and most parts of Europe, together with their blossoms, fruits, and seeds, observations on their culture, growth, and constitution and virtues, with directions on how to collect, pack up, and secure them in their passage. So this was basically his guide on 85 really interesting trees and shrubs, what's interesting about them, what you might want to do with them, what their good uses are, what's their beauty, and how to collect them. Do you collect the seeds, the whole fruit? How do you package that up and get it off to England so that it can be used in the gardens of England? And one of those popular things that Catesby sent over was this one right here, that Virginia creeper with its pretty red foliage of fall right there. That was one of the plants that was sent over. And the funny thing, or maybe ironic thing, is that it's now an invasive plant, listed invasive in Great Britain, sent over for its beautiful foliage there to Europe. So if you look just at the very beginning of this book, it gives you a pretty good idea of what Catesby was up to here. The very first page, very first paragraph even, he says the following here. Many kinds of American plants, and particularly forest trees and shrubs, have been procured and raised from thence, which, though hitherto principally in the possession of the opulent and curious, they, it is to be hoped, will, for the benefit of the country, be excited to encourage their propagation and increase, that both faunas and floras may be consulted, as well for the benefit of our woods as for ornaments to our gardens. So his idea here, his intent, is to tell people back in England about these really cool plants we have here, predominantly in the southeastern United States, that they might want to have in their gardens, in their woodlands, that have some sort of use, maybe just for their beauty. That's what he's telling people about here and getting them excited about these interesting southern plants. So if we look at what he did for artwork here, Catesby did phenomenal artwork of these plants, and he included things like the red bay, black tupelo, the wild olive, and sassafras right here, recognizable from those leaves, of course, and then telling people about this particular plant and what he had noticed about it, what he had learned about it. So as he says here, in Virginia, a strong decoction of the root has sometimes been given with good success for an intermitting fever. It will endure our climate in a warm situation. So what parts of England might it grow well in? What does it need for habitats to grow in as a sassafras in England? And he did this for 85 of these species, things like the mountain laurel that we have around here on rocky hillsides. As he says, I procured some plants of it from Pennsylvania. You might be able to guess where he got those from. John Bartram. Which, climate being nearer to that of England, some bunches of blossom were produced in July 1740 and 1741 in the garden of Mr. Collinson at Peckham. Mr. Collinson, the one who was funding, of course, John Bartram. A trumpet creeper was sent over, southern catalpa, crossvine. Many of these big, very beautiful southern plants became popular in England as Catesby wrote about them and did artwork of them, and then now they start to grow in the gardens over in England. But Catesby's telling them about them in his book here. So that starts the transfer of plants from North America over to England, and why we've got so many common plants of North America over in the gardens of England starting in the 1700s, due to the effect of Bartram and Catesby and many others, Tradescant, sending over these plants. But the same sort of thing happened here in the United States, just the other direction and a little bit later. So as early as 1620, so very early in our colonial history, we started to get things like the dandelion of Eurasia. That came over with people coming to the New World, perhaps even from the Pilgrims. English ivy came over very early in 1727. Chinaberry, tree of heaven, believe it or not, brought over intentionally, as we'll talk about here in a second, and many other plants that you would think of today as these troublesome invasives, Japanese honeysuckle, princess tree, brought over intentionally by people that weren't really thinking these were ever going to be a problem. They're just these pretty things that people are going to want to grow in their garden as different things that aren't in the woods here of the eastern United States. And who wouldn't want them in their garden? They weren't thinking about troubles that might come later on down the road. So some of these plants that we started to receive at this time, Chinese privet to plant as a hedge, that came over from Europe and from Asia. Chinaberry, princess tree right here with those big heart-shaped leaves. Tree of heaven, brought over as a street tree. These all started to come over in the 1700s and to be put into gardens here in the colonies and in the early United States, typically in people that had some wealth, be it at Monticello or Mount Vernon or somebody that's got a large garden. It's not going to be your just farmer or blacksmith or something like that, typically doing this sort of a planting back at that time period. One of the people that brought some of these plants over is André Michaux. He was a French naturalist, the botanist, royal botanist to King Louis XVI, who had done collecting throughout a lot of the eastern United States and North Carolina and South Carolina, up further into the north as well. And eventually, he established a garden in Charleston, a 111-acre garden, where he could take plants and try to get them to grow horticulturally, send off seeds and fruits to France, where they could grow those in gardens over there, but also receive plants from Europe, get those to grow in his garden, get them established horticulturally, and then pass off fruits and seeds to people around here in the colonies as well. It could be friends of his that are wealthy plantation owners, or perhaps John Bartram. He sent them to many people throughout the early United States and colonial time period. So his garden today in Charleston is no longer there. In fact, if you go and look for it, you're going to find an industrial zone like this right here near the Charleston airport. But that's where it used to be before it was sold off by his son in 1803 or thereabouts. But that was Michaux's garden in Charleston, South Carolina. So some of the things Michaux brought over are the crepe myrtle, that plant that's very common around shopping centers, people's yards. That was brought over as a horticulturally interesting plant by André Michaux. The mimosa tree, That was also brought over intentionally by Michaud. Unfortunately, now it spreads down our waterways, but it was something intentionally brought here, not by accident. And Bartram was not long after that selling it from his catalog as well, from his Philadelphia botanical garden. The Japanese camellia brought over by Michaud also. So we're starting to get that two-way transfer of plants. It's not just going to Europe. We're bringing things from Europe and Asia back here to the colonies, back to the early United States. It might be plants that were from Asia that were first brought to France or to England and grown there, or they may eventually just be coming from Asia directly, but a lot of it's coming from Europe at this time period. So as the US was forming as a young country, certain individuals of the wealth and status to have a large garden, people like William Hamilton here, wanted to establish an estate that mimicked what he would see over in England. So he wanted to kind of mimic the wealth and the look of that English style. So he established this estate called the Woodlands, which had been in his family for a few generations, and built a home there and wanted to establish this garden that mimicked England. So we went over to England here from the year 1784 to 85, toured around various gardens, hoping to bring their style back to his estate in Philadelphia. As he says here in a letter back to some of his gardeners, having observed with attention the nature, variety, and extent of the plantations of shrubs, trees, and fruits, and consequently admired them, I shall, if God grants me a safe return to my own country, endeavor to make it smile in the same useful and beautiful manner. So he wants to make his estate look like what he sees over there in England. And so that's what he did, establishing the Woodlands estate with this home right here and the surrounding gardens with all of these plants that he brings over from England to make his garden. So you might be thinking, we mentioned that Tree of Heaven was brought over intentionally here to the US, and who in their right mind would bring over Tree of Heaven? I mean, it's not that pretty of a tree. It stinks. Why would you bring that over? Well, talk to William Hamilton, because he's the guy that brought it over in 1784 to plant it at the Woodlands and establish it as part of his England-inspired garden. So it became popular thereafter and was planted as a street tree in many cities. So it grows fast. It doesn't have a lot of pests. Not much can kill it too easily. So it's a pretty easy tree to establish, and it grows up quickly and makes some shade. So it became quite popular at this time period as a street tree. In fact, the Tree of Heaven is the tree that is spoken about if you read the book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. There it is right there, this tree fighting against the odds, growing amongst all of that concrete in Brooklyn. The Tree of Heaven from Asia, brought over by William Hamilton in 1784. Other things Hamilton brought over, he brought over the Lombardy poplar in 1784. Once again, trying to make the Woodlands and his garden mimic what he saw over there in England with those prestigious gardens of the lords and dukes and all of the people of note there in England. So those are ones brought over intentionally to try to make your garden look like what somebody might see touring England. But it wasn't always intentional for how things got here. There's lots of plants that have been brought over accidentally. Just think of the Joro spider that you've got there in Georgia and now in South Carolina, not brought over intentionally. Accidents happen. It happens with plants too, and it happens very early in the movement of people here to the New World. So this book, 1672 by John Jocelyn, New England rarities and the plants and other organisms that you see in New England. He had a section in there on this chapter here called Of Such Plants as Have Sprung Up Since the English Planted and Kept Cattle in New England. So things like the south thistle and the groundsel, the dandelion, these plants that are not from here, but as soon as people started to come over, they've got these seeds that maybe are mixed in with other seeds, and all of a sudden, plants from Europe and Eurasia start to show up in the New World again. One of the earliest to do that is the common dandelion. This plant is native to Eurasia. It's not from here for the common dandelion, at least. We've got native dandelions, but this is the one from Eurasia. And it was likely brought over intentionally. This one very early brought over as an edible salad green. Dandelions also have a long history in Europe of herbal use. So brought over on purpose, perhaps even by the Pilgrims as the first people to bring it over here to the New World and North America. Common plantain also brought over, maybe not intentionally this time, but brought over accidentally, mixed in with some seeds of other things, or hitchhiking along in some barrel or produce of some sort. And so now this plant of Eurasia becomes very common, living around settlements of people coming over to the colonies to live. And wherever those people move to and wherever they live, you tend to find this plant, hence white man's foot. Wherever you go and look for the white man coming over from Europe, you find this plant as one of the possible name origins of this plant's common name. So if William Hamilton is establishing his garden there at the Woodlands, he established a lot of it with plants from England, trying to look like he was an English aristocrat. But could he have even done it natively if he wanted to? I mean, you all know if you go to the big box garden store and things like that, a lot of the plants come from elsewhere. They're not necessarily native to North America. Was that the same thing for William Hamilton back in the 1700s? Well, if you look at some of the broadsheets of plants that you could buy back at that time, this one here being from the first commercial nursery in the United States, the Prince Nursery at Flushing Landing in New York. It was established in 1737, and there's a lot of native trees on there, native shrubs that could be bought. What the Prince really specialized in was in orchard trees, so peaches and pears and apples. That was really their specialty. But they had other trees as well. So if you look over here in the timber trees and the flowering shrubs, the evergreen trees and shrubs, you can see a listing of what they had back there at this time period in the 1700s. And you could have bought black walnut and catalpa trees, possibly the northern catalpa here, but maybe southern catalpa too. Magnolias like the southern magnolia, sassafras, swamp chestnut oak, tulip tree that was becoming so popular over in England, the white oak as well. So there were things available to buy native trees and put them out in your garden. And that's coming from a 1771 catalog at the Prince's nursery there. John Bartram, with his botanical garden, put out a catalog of things you could buy from him as well. And he had a mixture of both. A lot of it was native stuff, things he was sending over to England because they were the ones kind of footing the bill here with buying his material. But he had a lot of things from elsewhere as well. So as his catalog says right here, it's a catalog of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants indigenous to the United States of America, cultivated and disposed of by John Bartram and Son, that's William, to which is added a catalog of foreign plants collected from various parts of the globe. So in this 1807 catalog, you could find things like this right here, the crepe myrtle being sold by Bartram Of course, he got that from you know who, from Andre Michaud, who first brought it over and then gave some to Bartram. And now Bartram is selling that crepe myrtle. So who knows if Michaud had never brought that over, maybe you wouldn't go to the shopping center and find crepe myrtles in the islands within the parking lot. Other things that he had here for sale, the mimosa tree, also brought over by Michaud, the white mulberry tree used for the potential establishment of a silk industry in the colonies, that was being sold by John Bartram as well. But there were a lot of native things on there too, and that's a lot of what he sold was native plants because he was selling those off to people in England, and these are things that they didn't know about. They didn't know about and hadn't seen these plants from the United States. This was new stuff that Bartram was able to provide to them. So things in this same catalog for plants indigenous, native to the United States, like Chickasaw plums. He was selling that and available to people here in the United States and also over into Europe. Rhododendrons, he had several different species. Rhododendrons became quite popular and common in the gardens of Europe due to the effect of John Bartram selling them to people over there in Europe. The white oak, Quercus alba, they're available for sale, as well as many other oaks here that are native to the eastern United States, as well as this one here. I've got it blocked for me. I'm not sure what that one says. I believe that is the American holly that might be showing up there. Nope, not American holly, but there's American holly right there, and many others. Kalmia latifolia, the mountain laurel, for sale there by John Bartram, another plant that became popular over in England through the effect of John Bartram sending these plants over to Europe. So native plants were available. There's another one, witch hazel, being sold by John Bartram back in 1807. So at this time, people that were growing plants, a lot of times they would grow some native things, but not necessarily as much native stuff as it was non-native things. So if you look in American Gardener's magazine in 1835, one of the early landscape architects in America, Andrew Jackson Downing, wrote an article in the magazine called On the Employment of Ornamental Trees and Shrubs in North America, where he spoke about how he wished people in the early United States would grow more of our plants from here. We have great plants to be proud of. They're beautiful. We don't have to get things from Asia and Europe. We've got beautiful things here too. And so as he says here, there is no country of the globe which produces a greater variety of fine forest trees, whether considered for the purposes of ornamenting or timber, than North America. Yet, it is a fact that for both these purposes, more particularly the first, they are horticulturally better known in many parts of Europe than they are now at home. Those governments have imported the seeds of all our most valuable forest trees annually for more than a century. So he's sort of perplexed at the behavior of people establishing their gardens with, why don't you put in the beautiful things from here? That's what the people in Europe do. Why is that not something that we should be doing as well to show the beauty of what we have here native to our own country, the new United States of America? And there were several people that felt this way. Thomas Jefferson being one of them that made statements similar to that. So Jefferson, if you've ever read America's Founding Gardeners, you may be familiar with some of the descriptions of him going and touring the gardens of Europe and going to places like the Lisos, a famous garden in England. And as he's doing that, he's looking at the plants that are over there in the Lisos and going, well, that's a rhododendron that I could find back at Monticello, or that's a tulip poplar that I could find just growing in the woods at Monticello. And all of these plants that are native to the forests of the eastern United States, native to Virginia, native even to Monticello, growing all the way over there at the Lisos. And so we found that interesting of how you can have all of these interesting plants growing over there so well. Things like the Rose Bay rhododendron, the maple leaf viburnum, the black tupelo, the mountain laurel, all growing over in these gardens of England that are plants right from Virginia, where Jefferson had Monticello. So he found it interesting and remarked in his hints to Americans traveling to Europe in 1788. He had a statement on gardens in there where he said, peculiarly worth the attention of an American because it is the country of all others where the noblest gardens may be made without expense. We have only to cut out the superabundant plants. These plants that you find in the gardens of Europe, we don't have to go searching all over to find them. They're right there in our woodlands. They're right there growing on the stream banks. You can go get a mountain laurel, get some seeds, and put that in your garden. It's right there, native to our own country, just like what the people of Europe would want to have sent all the way across an ocean to grow in their garden in England or France. So he found that interesting and a curious thing. And he wasn't the only one. One of the early sellers of native plants and proponents of native plants in early American history was Bernard McMahon. His name is spelled a few different ways, but it's all the same person. And he published this thing called the American Gardener's Calendar. And in his 1806 edition, he said this thing right here about plant in North America, our native plants, relative to things in Europe and what you see over there. So he says, in Europe, plants are not rejected because they are indigenous. On the contrary, they are cultivated with due care. And yet, here in the United States, we cultivate many foreign trifles and neglect the profusion of beauties so bountifully bestowed upon us by the hand of nature. In Europe, before they started to get things from Asia and before they started to get their plants coming from North America by Bartram, a lot of what they grew in their gardens over there were plants from Europe. And so they had a long history of growing European plants there that were well established in their gardening because they hadn't really had a chance to tour around the world and get those plants yet. But here in the US, as he's lamenting, we seem to ignore the things native to our own land. And that was a little sad to him, it seems, there for Bernard McMahon. So I guess we can reverse the direction of the arrows here a bit from what McMahon and Jefferson are thinking, where the same thing happens in the US, where the plants are always a little greener on the other side of the ocean from the perspective of some people. You always seem to have some people wanting that prestigious plant that is a little bit different and not something that you would find just off in the woods somewhere. It was unique and different. So that gives us sort of the history briefly of that trade of plants from North America to England and France and them sending plants over to us to establish some of the early gardens here in the United States. But that's not the only reason plants are brought over. We brought them over with the intent of helping to do conservation sometimes. Now, when you think of soil conservation, you might think of the Dust Bowl and the Great Plains and all of the things that happened back in the 1930s in Oklahoma and Kansas. These famous images harken back to that time of the Dust Bowl. But we had a similar sort of loss of a lot of our soil here in the Southeast too. So this is an image of a agricultural field from the South that's had a lot of erosion of that soil. And this happened across the South in the early part of the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, before the Dust Bowl happened. We had lost a lot of erosion, soil by erosion, due to just poor farming practices of tobacco and cotton. So a good example of that, good, I guess, if you want to think of it as an example of erosion, is what you can find at Georgia's Little Grand Canyon, as it's sometimes called, or Providence Canyon State Park down by Lumpkin. This is not a natural formation, so to speak, that you see here. It's not some geologic process that forms this deep valley. That's soil erosion from agriculture and cotton farming and tobacco farming and the lack of good farming techniques for conserving the soil that had not developed yet back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So some of these gullies here can be over 100 feet deep where the soil has simply been lost by erosion. So there were a lot of farms that were not too productive anymore. The soil had been lost, the productive topsoil that used to be there. And so along comes this miracle cure to help to restore that soil, to help prevent further erosion, to make that soil that was lost useful again. And so what was that plant that many people thought could bring that agriculture back, bring back the productivity of that soil and protect it? Well, the kudzu vine. So as you can see right here, this is a 1919 seed catalog, and in that catalog, you can buy seeds of the kudzu vine. As it describes it, the most luxuriant and rapid growing vine known in horticulture. So before kudzu was used for agriculture, it was a popular and common thing to grow around your front porch, around an arbor or a trellis. Many people called it porch vine because that's where you tend to grow it, is around the front porch, and it gets these beautiful flowers of pink and purple around your front porch, a grape sort of smell to those flowers. And many people found that to be an attractive vine. So you could look at gardening magazines back at that time period, and it would tell you, why not grow a vine like this over your porch? Plant some Japanese kudzu vine, and it'll ramble up your house and produce all of these beautiful flowers with this fragrant smell of the kudzu flower. So that's the initial reason for why kudzu was planted. Ornamental trade, particularly around trellises and people's front porch. But the problems with kudzu were seen pretty early on. So this is a description of kudzu from David Fairchild, where he wrote in his book here, The World Was My Garden, about his experiences trying to grow kudzu. And then it didn't work out so well, but once it did, it worked out a little too well, perhaps. So as he says here, I grew a lot of seedlings and scattered them about rather recklessly, having in mind the plant's stubborn refusal to grow for me before. The seedlings all took root with a vengeance, grew over the bushes and climbed the pines, smothering them with masses of vegetation which bent them to the ground and became an awful tangled nuisance. I spent over $200 in the years which followed trying to get rid of it. So he goes on to describe trying to get rid of this kudzu so he can sell his house that's being taken over by the kudzu there, and he can't stop it. This plant that initially he could hardly get to even grow because he was trying to grow it from seed. And kudzu doesn't establish too well from seeds. It establishes well from those root crowns, and then it grows much more easily. But we did have some warning signs early on that once this gets going, it can be hard to stop. But we planted it anyway. So the Soil Conservation Service, founded by FDR in the early 1930s, they started to promote kudzu as a way to keep soil from eroding, to protect that soil in the South where they had lost so much of that topsoil from erosion. And so you would see guides put out by the USDA, the Soil Conservation Service, on how you can grow kudzu on your farm. How deep do you plant it? When do you plant it? How all of the things that you need to know to plant kudzu were put out there for farmers and other people to learn about how to grow kudzu. perhaps the biggest influence, at least in Georgia, came from this guy right here, Channing Cope. He's what some people refer to as the kudzu king. He lived on a farm, Yellow River Farm, near Covington, southeast of Atlanta. And from there, he had a radio show that he had on twice a day. And he also wrote a column in the Atlanta Constitution where he spoke about the great virtues of kudzu. He was a great marketer and seemed to be kind of just quite a character. And was a very good salesperson for kudzu and all of the great things it can do for the farms of the South with erosion control and forage for livestock. And he put this into his radio programs, wrote about it in his book, Front Porch Farmer. He established these kudzu clubs for people to get kudzu from and learn about all the great virtues of kudzu. And from all of this, kudzu started to become quite popular for farmers to plant. It was even promoted by things like Georgia Power. So right here, Georgia Power saying in an advertisement from 1945, the Atlanta Daily World, now is the time to plant kudzu, the Earth's best friend, there in the Atlanta Daily World. So the Soil Conservation Service back at this time period would pay a farmer to plant kudzu on their farm, $8 an acre, or what would be about $190 an acre to plant kudzu, to protect that soil and to do the other benefits that kudzu can do. It was also planted in railroad right-of-ways, roadsides, to prevent the erosion of those areas as railroads are built, as roads are built. But it was also planted as a livestock forage, either a plant that you can put the cows out in to just eat right there, or something you can bale up to keep as forage for the winter time. With that rapid growth, if you could somehow get it to cut and bale up, it could make a good forage for those livestock later in the year. It's also a legume, so it can do nitrogen fixation and convert atmospheric nitrogen gas into usable forms of nitrogen for plants growing in that soil. So it was almost this miracle vine of all of these great things that one vine could do for this soil of the South that was lost and not doing too well after all of the erosion of the early period of the 1900s. In came kudzu to save the day, so we thought early on. But it didn't take long, just into the early 1950s, where we started to realize some of the problems with kudzu, and then the Soil Conservation Service, what later became the NRCS, stopped encouraging farmers to plant kudzu, and then it eventually, of course, became an invasive plant. But it's a problem of our own making, as it was planted to prevent other problems that we had that were more important at that time in the 1930s and 40s. So that's kudzu. Of course, the way we think of kudzu today, spreading over power lines, spreading over the woods, doing all of the things that kudzu does, specifically brought here to grow and cover things and prevent erosion. So I want to end this talk going over when did ornamental plantings as we think of them in the common people's yards become more common. So we've mentioned people like Hamilton, who was a person of great wealth with his big estate and what they're doing as a garden. But that's not something that the typical people, a farmer or a cobbler, something like that, in Hamilton's time would have been doing. The typical everyday person, the regular Americans, would have started to embrace those ornamentals sometime starting after the Civil War and then progressing into the 20th century. And there's several reasons for that. One of which is that as there became more roads, as people live near towns and cities more, they're becoming less dependent on growing their own fruits, growing their own vegetables to feed themselves. So less dependent on that kitchen garden that grows out in the front yard to feed you throughout the year. In addition, there started to be more and more readily available garden magazines and seed catalogs where somebody could buy seeds and have those sent to their home to come in on the railway or some other way to get that seed to you to plant in your yard. And some of those catalogs would tell you a lot of things about how to plant it and how to present that in your yard. So this example from Garden Magazine in 1924 gives you some ideas of how you could put the shrubberies around your yard and what things would pair well together. You didn't just have to know this or be some aristocrat who has gardeners that know that. You can read it yourself in a gardening magazine and know that if I want shrubs that form this nice harmony, why don't I get a native fringe tree and I'll put in some common privet and some California privet and some rose of Sharon and all of these things that pair well together as a particular shrub outlay. Unfortunately, some of the ones they were recommending are things that are today known to be invasive species in the Southeast. Rosa multiflora right there, different privets. Each of those with the blue arrow is an invasive species of the southeastern United States today. But they did also promote native plantings in the same issue with the same article about things you can put in your yard. Things like goldenrods, believe it or not, which were actually a popular thing to grow over in England and France, promoting those and many other native plants to pair together and grow in your yard, all the way back in 1924. So there was some push for native things. Shortly thereafter, getting into the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was also a shift with the lack of gardening in the front yard with that kitchen garden to have the yard become a bit more of a thing for leisure and pleasure and just being outside with the family and doing things that we think of for yards today. And so you would see lawn mowers and things like that in the garden catalog. And as it says here, without a lawn, a house is no home. And so you can use this lawn for your leisure and pleasure. And right there with that same catalog, they've got all sorts of seeds you can buy of all sorts of Asian and European plants that can come right to your house down the road or down the train track. So that's sort of how things started to become more popular to do ornamental planting for everyday regular Americans and not just the aristocrats and people of lots of wealth. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions about anything that you might have. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Storm. That was definitely insightful. I'm going to have nightmares tonight with kudzu coming over and attacking me. So the interesting thing is I grew up within a stone's throw of where that guy lived on the Yellow River in Newton County. Yep. Didn't even know it. There's no sign there now commemorating how good it was back then. For kudzu.
He was the big promoter in Georgia and really throughout much of the eastern U.S. with the establishment of the kudzu clubs. So yeah, Yellow River Farm.
Yeah, it's crazy. One thing that relates to a very active initiative for the Georgia Native Plant Society, and that is we want to change our state flower from an invasive plant from China, which is the Cherokee Rose, into a beautiful native here in Georgia, which is the Sweet Bay Magnolia. So you can go to our website and look at that. So we're trying again with the state legislature. A new bill was introduced that combines making Sweet Bay Magnolia the state flower, and it'll also make April by law the native plant month for Georgia. So those efforts are going on. So we do want you all, if you haven't already, or even if you have, contact them again. Contact both your state rep and senator and encourage them to make that change and tell them we don't need, with the biodiversity we have in Georgia, we do not need a foreign, non-invasive or invasive plant representing us when we have so many beautiful native plants that will foot the bill. Following of like the invasive insects had anything to do with the introduction of the native or the non-native plants.
As you bring over plants, you can also bring over things other than just the plants. So there's many instances of insects with their eggs, or things like lizards, spiders being brought over with plants with the intention of bringing plants, but hidden in that plant are insect eggs, a lizard that's not from North America. So certainly that happens an awful lot. And also just in the soil. I mean, what's in that soil from eggs laid by an insect? Uh, how do you get various crickets from Asia growing here in the southeastern US? Well, you bring over plants from Asia and they've got some of that soil, and that soil has cricket eggs in it. You're probably going to introduce some of those insects that laid eggs in that soil. So that certainly happens.
So do you know of a lot of the invasive stuff that's brought over for horticulture?
Mhm.
What we're looking at now, what has become an infestation over here, is it a cultivar of what
Of
that
which
native
particular
species would have
plant?
been? Just in general, I'm thinking.
Oh, uh, I would say so, yeah. So uh, by the time we were getting things here into the US, plants being brought over from Europe, they had been grown in gardens for many decades there, if not a couple of centuries. And so they had selected for particular looks. They were certainly selecting, even without thinking about it, for particular ones that could survive that passage, that could survive the way they were treating them. And so what you're getting is a pretty hardy plant. If it's not something that would have survived the passage and the way they're growing them on a completely different continent, it wouldn't have survived, and we wouldn't be growing it here today. So they had, whether they would think of it or not, had selected for some sort of a cultivar of that plant that came from the wild of Asia or wherever they happened to get it from. They just didn't have a name necessarily, but they may have selected for certain flower colors or something.
Yep. So Victoria did ask a question. So is there any documentation before the 1500s or before we began
Uh,
trading ships on plants in North
for things
America?
coming like to the U.S.,
Well, no, just what was native back then. I mean, what is that earliest documentation?
okay, of what would have been native here in North America.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, there wouldn't be a lot of good information for that. So that's where it's problematic sometimes to figure out, is a plant native to here or not. So there is some argument as to whether the plantain is actually native to North America. Is it just spread across the northern hemisphere? I think most people think it's from Eurasia and was not native to North America. But there are certain plants like the mock strawberry that it was here pretty much since people started coming over to North America, and it might be native to North America. That mock strawberry that grows in yards, but probably from India is where it's native to. But it's hard to say. We don't really have good lists of all of those plants because until Mark Catesby and Lawson, Bartram start to do their explorations, we don't have any listing of what those plants were. So the earliest person might be John Lawson, who left Charleston, I believe it was like December 30th, 1699, I think is when he took off and sailed up into North Carolina. And he wrote about some of those plants and animals that he saw. But that's about the earliest record that we have. There's some other things up in Virginia, but not great lists going back into the 1500s, really.
So do we have any documentation or records from the Native American tribes?
Uh, Not that I know of that are good records. There may be some things of, I know there are some records from like the DeSoto expeditions of things that they saw. Like they describe animals that sound like they're seeing bison. They didn't really have a name for it, like bison that we use today, but it sure sounds like what they're describing are bison. But they don't necessarily have a name for things. They're describing the appearance, and we can read that description and go, I bet they're talking about this or that based on the description that they're giving us. But there wouldn't be a name that they would necessarily know to give it.
Yep. All right. So last chance to put in a question. So I'm going to ask one last thing. If nobody else has anything, so we'll end it. But we talk a lot about things coming from Europe and Asia. Is there any plants you would say that are problems like coming from like South America or Central America?
Yeah. So the Kew Garden has a nice list of invasive plants in England for things that are from elsewhere. For instance, I mentioned the Virginia creeper as one invasive plant that's common here in the Southeast that they brought over for their gardens and has kind of taken off into woodlands and become a problem. The squirrels, our red squirrel over here is a problem over there. Our gray squirrel is a problem over there. So there's plants and animals that they have brought over that can become problematic in England, where it's not in the right kind of habitat. It doesn't have the typical predators, and they can sort of take off. But a lot of the plants that we think of as here that are problematic are from Asia, and there's several ideas on why that might be. What is it about those plants in particular? And one line of thought on that is that the habitat where those plants from Asia come from are very competitive. There's lots of species there. So the ones we bring over are pretty strong survivors. They're very competitive from those diverse habitats where we got them from. And when we bring them here, and they keep their leaves for a large part of the year and shade out some of our natives, and they're very competitive, they can be a pretty invasive plant. But a lot of the stuff that's invasive comes from Asia. But we also have things from the United States that are problematic in other places too.
Yep. All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions. So I do want to thank everybody for joining. And thank you, Dr. Storm, again for presenting tonight. So we